When I first laid eyes on the wooded property nestled on the edge of the Willow Creek subdivision, I knew I had found my escape from the madness of suburbia. After years of living with thin walls, nosy neighbors, barking dogs, and endless HOA notices about mailbox paint colors or how high my grass was allowed to grow, I craved solitude and self-governance. The 5-acre spread I bought was not only surrounded by nature, tall pines, dense thickets, and a small creek at the back, but also legally separate from the HOA itself. It sat adjacent to the neatly gridded houses of Willow Creek, yet according to every county map, zoning document, and deed restriction I had triple-checked with my real estate lawyer, it was its own parcel. Not 1 cent of my money was owed to any association, nor were any bylaws applicable to my land. It was exactly what I wanted: peace, privacy, and freedom from Karen types who treated neighborhood decorum like gospel. I closed the deal in late spring and moved in the first weekend of June with my German Shepherd, Ranger, and a modest moving truck carrying years of boxed-up dreams and minimalist furniture. My house was a modest but sturdy log-style home built in the late 90s with enough updates to make it cozy but not flashy. I spent the first night on the back porch sipping iced tea, marveling at how quiet everything was aside from chirping cicadas and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. That bliss, however, was short-lived. The next morning, as I was finishing breakfast and sorting through unpacked boxes in the kitchen, I heard a knock at the front door, sharp, deliberate, and repeated 3 times like a punctuation mark of entitlement. When I opened the door, there she stood. A middle-aged woman with frosted blonde hair shellacked into a helmet, wearing a pastel blouse tucked neatly into pressed capris and holding a pristine clipboard like it was the Constitution itself. She smiled with the hollow cheeriness of someone about to deliver bad news and introduced herself as Karen Holloway, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. "I just wanted to personally welcome you to the neighborhood," she said, stepping forward without invitation, her expensive perfume trailing behind her like a chemical fog. She extended a folder toward me, neatly labeled "Welcome Packet," as if it were a gift. "This contains everything you need to know about your responsibilities now that you're part of the community. Covenants, conditions, restrictions, the usual." She spoke with that overly rehearsed cadence you hear from HOA board members who take their unpaid role way too seriously. And it took me all of 2 seconds to realize this was exactly the sort of person I had hoped to avoid by buying this property. I accepted the folder, mostly to get her to stop holding it out like a lit torch, and glanced at the contents. There were glossy printed rules, a list of approved paint colors, a calendar of upcoming mandatory community events, and even a letter demanding a $350 initial compliance fee. My eyebrows lifted. "This must be a mistake," I said, handing it back to her. "My property isn't part of the HOA. I had everything reviewed by the title company and a lawyer. It's separate. Always has been." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed slightly, and her hand didn't move to take the folder back. "Well, I think you'll find that you're adjacent to Willow Creek, and since your driveway connects to our roads, that technically makes you subject to our jurisdiction. It's a matter of shared access. It's all in the covenants." That's when I knew I wasn't just dealing with a busybody. I was dealing with a bureaucratic zealot armed with pseudo-legal nonsense and a messiah complex. "No offense, Karen, but I'm not signing anything. I'm not part of your HOA. I bought this property because it wasn't under any restrictions. The roads are public. My land is private. We're done here." Her lips tightened into a line so thin it could have sliced glass. She finally accepted the folder back, clutching it with both hands like it personally offended her that I wouldn't bow down. "I hope you understand that the Willow Creek HOA is responsible for maintaining the character and safety of this community. We expect all residents, even adjacent ones, to comply. We wouldn't want issues to arise," she said, her voice lilting into that fake sweet tone used to disguise threats as polite conversation. I stood tall, didn't blink. "We wouldn't want trespassing to become an issue either," I replied flatly, then shut the door. I watched through the peephole as she stood on my porch for a few moments longer than necessary, likely expecting me to open the door again in defeat. When I didn't, she turned and stormed off, heels crunching on the gravel. That was the beginning. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. First, I began receiving mail addressed to Resident, Willow Creek HOA, with warning notices about violations, such as storing tools visibly in my driveway and placing a trash bin in the wrong orientation. I laughed at the absurdity, tossed them into the recycling bin, and thought that would be the end of it. Then came the cars. Slow-moving sedans with tinted windows began cruising past my property multiple times a day. I spotted the same blue SUV lingering across the street around 4 p.m. daily. I knew it was one of the board members Karen had mentioned, Steve, our compliance officer, because she had practically bragged about their enforcement team. Once I saw him with binoculars. That's when I installed cameras motion-triggered for K quality and pointed at every angle of my property with cloud backups. If they wanted a war, I was more than capable of documenting every skirmish. Then came the unthinkable. One Saturday morning, while I was working on building a raised garden bed behind my garage, I heard Ranger bark aggressively. He's trained to alert me but rarely barks unless something truly threatens his space. I walked around to the front and found Karen, again, standing halfway up my driveway, clipboard in hand, phone raised like she was documenting me. "You can't have unpermitted structures," she barked before I could even ask what she was doing on my property. "That wood pile violates fire code, and the fence you're installing doesn't meet height requirements. I'm going to issue a formal citation." I took a step toward her, staying calm but cold. "You're trespassing, Karen. You're not allowed on my property. If you don't leave right now, I will call the sheriff." She scoffed like I had insulted her personally and said, "Don't you dare threaten me. I represent the neighborhood. You don't get to opt out of community." That's when I calmly pulled out my phone, turned on the video and said, "This is my land. You're not invited. Leave now, or I will have you arrested for trespassing." The fury in her eyes was nuclear, but she turned and marched off with one final declaration. "You'll regret being so combative." For the next week, things escalated further. Fake violation notices turned into formal-looking letters stamped with what appeared to be legal language, though none of it cited any real laws or ordinances. One letter even claimed that my refusal to comply would result in a lien against my property. That's when I hired a real estate attorney named Carla, a sharp-as-nails woman who took one look at the documents and chuckled. "These are nonsense," she said. "They have no jurisdiction over you. But if they try to file a lien, even a fake one, we'll sue for fraud and harassment." That gave me enough peace of mind to let Karen's madness roll off my back. For now, the final straw of Chapter 1 came the following Friday evening. I was out back grilling burgers when I heard Ranger bark again. Louder, more aggressive this time. I ran to the front yard and caught Karen in the act, stepping over the low boundary stones I had placed to mark my property line. Her clipboard was gone, replaced with a measuring tape and camera, as if she were building a legal case. I didn't yell this time. I simply turned on the sprinkler system and walked back to my porch. Watching her scramble in designer sandals, soaked and shrieking, was the first true joy I'd felt since moving in. She screamed something about legal consequences and gross disrespect, but I just waved. She finally left, and that night I began compiling all my footage into one folder, HOA Evidence. I had a feeling I was going to need it. What she didn't understand, what she refused to understand, was that not everyone could be bullied into compliance. Some people stood their ground. Some people built fences not to divide but to defend. And I was one of them. The war had only just begun. Karen Holloway was not the type to back down after a single defeat. In fact, after I denied her entry to my property and calmly soaked her with my sprinkler system, something in her snapped. Most people, after being told they had no legal authority over a parcel of land, would have backed off and accepted the reality. But Karen, driven by delusions of power, a festering obsession with order, and what I suspect was an undiagnosed case of narcissistic rage, went the opposite direction. She didn't retreat. She retaliated. Within 24 hours of our last confrontation, I began receiving daily letters slipped under my gate and sometimes rubber-banded to my mailbox. Each one came in an HOA envelope bearing the Willow Creek insignia, an oak tree with the words, preserving community integrity since 1992, wrapped in a circle like a seal of smug authority. The letters accused me of various violations, including improper trash bin storage, grass height exceeding acceptable aesthetic standards, visible tools in the yard, an unsanctioned vehicle, my ATV parked beside my garage, and my personal favorite, unauthorized construction of a Class C outbuilding, which was clearly referencing the prefab toolshed I had just installed. The fact that I wasn't part of the HOA didn't seem to matter to Karen or her board. It was as if she had declared herself the sovereign queen of a kingdom she didn't own, and I was her defiant peasant refusing to bow. First, I laughed them off. My lawyer Carla assured me that as long as I wasn't under their jurisdiction, and I absolutely wasn't, these letters were worth less than junk mail. Still, I documented everything. I created a digital folder titled HOA Harassment, Phase 2, and stored every envelope, every letter, and every strange incident, complete with time-stamped photos and video footage from my security cameras. And speaking of cameras, I added 2 more around the perimeter. One by the back tree line where Karen's husband, a retired dentist named Bob who looked perpetually confused, had started pacing on evening walks, and another facing the narrow strip of woods that bordered the HOA property. It turned out Karen had turned her board members into her personal reconnaissance team. One day I caught Steve, the compliance officer, standing on a step stool outside my fence with a clipboard in one hand and a measuring tape dangling from the other. I watched from my porch in stunned disbelief as he strained to get a better view of my backyard like a teenager trying to peek into a movie theater. When I stepped out and greeted him with a cheerful, "Need help with something, Steve?" He dropped his clipboard, muttered something about monitoring community aesthetics, and scurried off. I retrieved his clipboard, of course. It contained a sketch of my property with scribbled notes like, "Structure here?" and "Noise, dog bark 7:16 a.m." I snapped a photo before leaving it neatly on his driveway. By week 2, Karen went nuclear. She filed a formal complaint with the county zoning office, claiming I was building illegal structures and violating noise ordinances. An actual county inspector showed up at my door mid-morning while I was staining some deck boards. He was polite but confused, saying someone had reported possible code violations, including unpermitted construction and improper land use. I showed him my permits, all perfectly in order, and invited him to walk the grounds. "Looks fine to me," he said, shrugging. "I'll file this as a false report. Honestly, we've been getting a lot of odd complaints from that HOA lately." It turns out Karen had made similar calls about 2 other residents in the area. Neighbors who weren't technically in the HOA either but lived close enough to suffer her wrath. I invited one of them, a retired mechanic named Duke, over for a beer that weekend. He told me how Karen had once tried to have his backyard bonfire pit demolished, citing fire hazard proximity. "She tried to get my trees cut down," he laughed bitterly. "Said they were aesthetically disruptive." Karen wasn't just overstepping her bounds. She was making it her personal mission to conquer anyone she didn't control. One Thursday afternoon, I returned from the hardware store to find Karen parked halfway in my driveway, standing next to my mailbox and scribbling something onto a clipboard. I pulled in slowly, gave her a long honk, and stepped out of my truck. "What the hell are you doing now, Karen?" I asked, not bothering to hide my exhaustion. She didn't even flinch. "Inspecting for non-compliance. I have every right." She pointed toward my toolshed like it was a crime scene. "That is an unapproved structure, and I believe you've recently planted invasive bamboo on the southern border. I'm compiling a report." I was stunned by the audacity. "You're not allowed to inspect anything on my property," I said, stepping between her and the mailbox. "You are not an inspector. You are not the government. You are trespassing." She puffed herself up like a turkey in mating season and snarled, "The good of the community depends on everyone following the rules. You chose to live next to us. You're not exempt just because you want to be some cowboy." She gestured around her dramatically. "This neighborhood has standards. We built something beautiful here, and we won't let one rogue element destroy it." I didn't respond. I just took out my phone, again, and began recording. "You're being filmed. Leave now or I call the sheriff." Her eyes narrowed, jaw clenched, But finally, she stormed off without another word, muttering about litigation as she went. The next week, things got truly ugly. I received an official-looking letter in a manila envelope labeled Lien Notification. Inside was a document, obviously drafted by Karen or someone she had convinced to help her, claiming that I owed the Willow Creek HOA $2,100 in back compliance fees, including citations for unauthorized land development, aesthetic pollution, and behavior unbecoming of a resident. The letter stated that the HOA was placing a lien against my property effective immediately and that a collections process would follow. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I immediately called Carla and emailed her a scan of the letter. She responded within 15 minutes. This is fraudulent, completely unenforceable. I'll handle it. That same day, Carla filed a cease and desist order against the HOA, sent a formal demand to Karen's personal address. We'd acquired it during the earlier legal consultation, and forwarded a complaint to the county clerk's office. If she tries to record that lien officially, she's opening herself up to civil and possibly criminal liability, Carla told me. And if she's done this to others, we might be looking at a pattern of abuse. That's actionable. While Carla prepared the paperwork, I decided to escalate in my own way. I printed color copies of Karen's fake lien and taped them to my front gate under a banner that read, "Warning. Fraudulent documents circulating. HOA has no authority here. Trespassers will be prosecuted." The sign was big, bold, and visible from the road. Within 2 hours, Steve, the compliance officer, drove past in his SUV, slowed down, and took photos. Within 6 hours, I spotted Karen herself standing across the street, seething and talking into her phone, gesturing toward my gate like she was narrating a hostage situation. The next morning, a different neighbor I hadn't met before, a young mom named Tasha, knocked on my door with a cup of coffee and an introduction. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, "for putting that sign up. Karen tried to fine us last year for putting solar panels on our roof. Said they disrupted visual harmony. You're doing what the rest of us were too scared to do." I realized then that I wasn't just dealing with an annoying woman with too much time on her hands. I was dealing with someone who had built an entire fiefdom based on intimidation and hollow threats, and for years nobody had pushed back hard enough to make her stop. The final nail in Karen's coffin, for this chapter, anyway, came when Carla submitted a formal complaint to the state HOA Regulatory Board, which does exist, thankfully, and the county clerk rejected the lien outright. They even sent me a letter confirming that no legal filing had been made or accepted, which I immediately framed and hung on my wall with sarcastic pride. Carla recommended we keep going. "This isn't just a case of harassment," she said. "It's fraud. If we get enough people together, we can bring a civil case or even lobby for an audit of the entire HOA board." That idea excited me. I began printing flyers, discreetly, and slipping them under the doors of other neighbors who had expressed frustration with Karen in the past. I set up a private email account, willowcreekvoices@protonmail.com, and asked people to share their stories anonymously. Within a week, I had 13 replies. Some were brief. "She fined us $500 for parking an RV for 3 hours. Others were long, painful stories about threats, manipulation, and years of forced compliance under vague or non-existent rules. Karen hadn't just lost her mind when I refused to let her onto my property. She had declared war, but she wasn't ready for someone who had time, receipts, legal backing, and a deep, stubborn streak of resistance. What she didn't realize is that when you try to impose your will on someone who values their independence above all else, you're not just picking a fight, you're lighting a fuse." And chapter 2 ended with that fuse burning fast. It was a calm Thursday morning when the official notification from the county clerk's office arrived in my mailbox, confirming what I already knew. The lien Karen had attempted to place on my property was entirely fraudulent and had been rejected outright. The letter was brief, precise, and powerful. It stated, in clear language, that Willow Creek Homeowners Association had no authority or jurisdiction over my land, and that any attempts to claim otherwise would be considered a violation of local real estate statutes. I stood there on my porch, coffee in one hand, letter in the other, and smiled in a way I hadn't in weeks. It wasn't just a victory for me. It was the first step in unraveling the tangled web of control Karen had been spinning over the neighborhood for years. With Carla's legal help, I prepared a response letter of my own and sent a copy directly to Karen's address with a professional yet biting note. Cease and desist your unlawful actions immediately. Further infractions will be met with civil litigation. I knew it would sting not just because it was direct, but because it came with the weight of real legal consequence. Something Karen had long believed herself immune to. But I wasn't content to simply block her attacks. I wanted to understand the full scope of what she'd been doing, not just to me, but to the entire community. So I started digging. Over the next 2 weeks, I compiled documentation, testimonies, and public records. I visited the county land office, spoke to a zoning clerk who was all too eager to share stories about that woman from Willow Creek, and gathered evidence of repeated overreach by the HOA. I learned that Karen had been placing informal notices on properties for years, claiming minor infractions and tacking on arbitrary fees, many of which had no basis in the HOA charter or any municipal regulation. People paid because they were intimidated, unaware that the documents were often doctored or lacked legal standing. I found a neighbor, Miguel, whose driveway Karen had tried to claim was non-conforming due to the type of gravel he used, and another, Sheila, who had been fined for hosting an unauthorized gathering when her book club ran 5 minutes past curfew. The stories poured in: fines for garden gnomes, threats over bird feeders, and once, a written warning for having excessively loud wind chimes. It was absurd, yet each of these incidents painted a picture. Karen had turned the HOA into her personal tool of domination, and no one had stopped her. With Carla's guidance, I began helping other homeowners draft rebuttals, file formal disputes, and in some cases, request audits of their fines. It was surprisingly easy once they realized they weren't alone. Many had suffered in silence, thinking they were the only ones being targeted. But the moment they saw others standing up, their courage ignited. We met quietly, sometimes on my porch, sometimes at the local library conference room, sharing documents, reviewing letters, and organizing a timeline of Karen's misconduct. Each new file made our case stronger. One elderly couple, the Parkers, revealed they'd paid over $4,000 in bogus annual assessments Karen had invented after a board vote that never actually happened. Their granddaughter helped me scan every document they'd kept, and the sheer gall of Karen's forged letterhead and aggressive language made Carla livid. "This goes beyond civil infractions," she said during a call. "If we can prove intent, this may rise to the level of fraud and extortion." I could hear the click of her keyboard as she typed. "And if she used HOA funds to pursue this harassment, that's misappropriation. Let's build the full case." Meanwhile, I continued to bait Karen, but only with the truth. I installed a discreet loudspeaker at my gate that played a looping message when someone approached, stating, "This property is privately owned and not subject to Willow Creek HOA regulations. All activity is monitored and recorded. Trespassers will be prosecuted." I even updated the sign on my fence to include the county clerk's letter, laminated and sealed behind a plexiglass panel for all to see. Predictably, Karen showed up 3 days later, once again standing on the public sidewalk just outside my property, screeching into her phone. She called someone, maybe another board member, and waved her hands dramatically while pointing at my security camera. "This man is harassing the entire community," she yelled. "He's undermining order." What she didn't realize was that my new cameras captured her audio clearly, and I now had over 18 minutes of unhinged ranting, most of it implicating her in behavior that looked a lot like unlawful intimidation. I clipped the best bits into a highlight reel and stored them in a folder titled Karen Compilation for Media. I didn't have to wait long to use it. One of the neighbors I'd helped, a local reporter named Dana who worked part-time for our town's online news publication, asked if she could interview me. She had already heard rumors about Karen's antics and thought the story could shine a spotlight on HOA abuse. "People don't realize how much unchecked power some of these boards have," she said. "What you're doing, it's bigger than one person. It's about accountability." We filmed the interview at my dining table. Dana kept the tone professional, even as we reviewed the clips of Karen shouting into the void and the letters she'd sent me. 2 days later, the story went live. HOA gone rogue. Local president accused of fraud, harassment. The article went viral, at least by small-town standards. Comments flooded in. Some defended Karen, but the majority shared similar experiences. A few brave souls even dropped anonymous tips about financial irregularities in the HOA's budget, referencing dues collected and never properly itemized. Karen's response was immediate and hysterical. That same evening, she summoned an emergency HOA board meeting, which she tried to hold on the community greenbelt. But several of the board members didn't show up. One even emailed me later saying he was no longer comfortable participating in an organization facing possible legal scrutiny. Only Steve, the compliance officer, and one elderly woman named Margaret joined her, standing stiffly as Karen ranted to a dwindling crowd of about 10 residents. I watched from across the street, camera rolling, as she shouted about defamation, a smear campaign, and how the real threat is the man next door who thinks he's above the law. Her voice cracked as she pointed toward my property. "He's destroying the fabric of this neighborhood," she shrieked. That's when something remarkable happened. A man I'd never met, Derek, a schoolteacher who had moved in 6 months prior, stepped forward and said, "No, Karen, you are. You've bullied people long enough." Silence fell like a dropped piano. Karen turned pale. More voices joined. "You fined my daughter for chalk drawings. You told me my fence was too cheerful. You screamed at my mother over a potted plant." The crowd slowly dispersed as she stood there trembling, her illusion of control fracturing like a cracked mirror. Within 48 hours, the HOA's general membership called for a vote of no confidence. Using the very bylaws Karen had long manipulated, several residents launched a petition to remove her. Carla and I guided them quietly, using the evidence we'd collected. The tipping point came when leaked financials revealed she used HOA funds for personal landscaping, disguised as community enhancement. Outrage spread fast, and by week's end, the board suspended her. Karen wasn't finished. One morning, she appeared at my driveway in a bathrobe, clutching a manila folder. She hesitated, then dropped the folder, filled with half-written and signed citations, and walked away without a word. I shredded them on the spot. Her reign was over. The next day, Carla called. The county was reviewing our materials for possible charges: fraud, misuse of funds, abuse of power. I handed over everything: documents, video, a detailed timeline. This was no longer personal. It was justice. The illusion of Karen's control had collapsed. Without her shadow, the neighborhood began to heal. People started speaking to one another again. Kids played freely. A block cookout was organized. The HOA held fresh elections with transparency and oversight. Karen didn't run. Rumors said she was selling her house and moving closer to her daughter. I didn't celebrate. I just exhaled, finally at peace. 2 weeks later, on a gray morning, she came back, disheveled, screaming at my gate. "You ruined everything," she shrieked. Neighbors filmed as she ranted and flung old violation notices through the bars. I stayed inside and called the sheriff. When deputies arrived, she tried playing the victim, but they didn't buy it. "You've been removed," one told her. "This is private property." Her mask slipped. She screamed about betrayal, sobbing in frustration. The deputy calmly led her away as neighbors watched in silence. That afternoon, she was cited for trespassing and harassment. A restraining order barred her from coming near me again. The HOA board held an emergency vote and formally removed her from all roles. Notices were mailed, and her fall from power was complete. An audit revealed massive misuse of funds, phony landscaping bills, double-billed contractors, even a $1,200 check marked emergency beautification. The new interim board promised reform. Public meetings began, fines were frozen, and transparency returned. Meanwhile, the homeowners' rights group Carla and I had quietly built, Fairgrounds, grew rapidly. Over 300 signatures came in county-wide. Carla drafted a proposal for county oversight of HOAs, and a council member reached out to discuss legislation. Karen's meltdown sparked something bigger. Change. Eventually, her house went up for sale quietly, cheaply. A young couple bought it, and the day it sold, neighbors gathered to toast its departure with champagne. I wasn't there, but I saw the photos. Smiles of survivors finally free. Still, I kept my security cameras, not out of fear but as a reminder. Standing your ground matters. And sometimes, change starts with one person saying no more. Over time, my neighbors and I grew closer. The book clubs returned, no longer policed for volume or unauthorized laughter. Sidewalk chalk reappeared. Even the Parkers, who had once paid Karen thousands in phony fines, invited the whole block over for an outdoor movie night. They projected a film onto their garage, and as we all sat there in lawn chairs under the stars, someone joked, "Bet Karen would fine us for popcorn kernels on the driveway." Laughter erupted, but it was different this time. Light, not nervous. Real. Karen's downfall became a kind of parable. New homeowners were warned about her saga, not with bitterness, but with a chuckle and a lesson. Never let someone build a throne where only a bench belongs. Her name faded from the newsletter, her bylaws were rewritten, and her legacy was buried under the soil of a rejuvenated neighborhood. But I never erased the footage. I kept it stored, archived, ready to be dusted off only if history dared to repeat itself. And so, with Karen gone, my land stayed peaceful, just the way I intended. The wind blew soft across the field behind my house. The birds returned to the feeder Karen once said was an eyesore. And every sunset felt a little more earned. Not because I had won some petty war, but because I'd stood firm. Because I'd reminded my community and myself that sometimes the quietest revolutions begin with one person simply saying, no.